Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, what can the Louvre do about the Mona Lisa? Plus, Judy Chicago at the Serpentine in London and Christian Schad in Vienna. As the Louvre's director admits that it wants to move its most famous painting away from the crowded gallery in which it's currently displayed, we asked the Leonardo specialist Martin Kemp, does the museum have a Mona Lisa problem? We also talk about the painting's continuing allure and the efforts to explain its mysteries. In London, remarkably, Judy Chicago has just opened her first major multidisciplinary survey in a British public gallery at the Serpentine North. I went there to talk to her. And this episode's Work of the Week is Christian Schad's self-portrait with model from 1927. The painting features in Splendour and Misery, new Objectivity in Germany at the Leopold Museum in Vienna. Hans-Peter Wipplinger, the director of the museum and co-curator of the show, tells us more. Before all that, our latest subscription offer, a free 6-week trial of a digital subscription to The Art Newspaper. Visit theartnewspaper.com to find out more. And do also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, the director of the Louvre, Laurence Descartes, has said that the world's most visited museum must find a solution to the problems caused by the painting that makes it so popular, Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Descartes has admitted that visitors who want to see La Gioconda, as the painting is known in Paris, are not well received, as she puts it. She believes that Leonardo's masterpiece deserves its own space instead of sharing a room with works by Venetian artists. According to reports, the Louvre has estimated that a new underground entrance leading to a special space for Leonardo's portrait and an exhibitions gallery would cost around 500 million euros. But the French state has been clear it will not help with funding and has just cut 200 million euros from the culture budget. Meanwhile, the mystery of the Mona Lisa's sitter and landscape, which has prompted so much of the intrigue behind its fame, continues to prompt investigation. The latest being that a geologist has proposed the exact location of Leonardo's vista based on extensive travels around Italy. So what can be done about the painting and what explains the obsession around it? The Art Newspaper's associate digital editor, Alexander Morrison, spoke to the renowned Leonardo scholar and emeritus professor of the history of art at the University of Oxford, Martin Kemp.
Martin, the Mona Lisa is a global obsession and it can sometimes feel like it's too popular for its own good. Last year, 8.9 million people visited the Louvre and it's estimated that 80% of those people were there to see the Mona Lisa. And when you get there, there's a kind of tragedy to it because you're standing behind a huge crowd of people with their iPhones in the air and you get maybe 30 seconds with the work. You know, tourist polls are calling it the world's most disappointing attraction. The Louvre are trying to deal with this. So one of the big news stories of the last couple of weeks has been the Louvre director, Laurence Descartes, saying that she would like to ideally move the Mona Lisa to its own space that would be accessed via a special tunnel. The issue being that it would be a 500 million euro cost. My first question to you is, do you think that a move would be helpful?
In a way, it's an intractable problem. This is an intimate picture. It's a very personal picture done for the sitter's husband and would have been seen in very private circumstances. And indeed, she looks at us, which means it's a rather unusual picture in that respect. For a woman to do eye contact is rather daring. So the Louvre are faced with an impossibility. The idea that you can display this adequately to millions of visitors and the actual function and operation of the portrait is completely impossible. So I think it would make it better in terms of visitor experience if it was moved into a space with better circulation, but it's not going to solve the basic problem that this is not a picture for huge crowds of people to see at the same time.
No, and I mean, what do you think of the current setup? Because as it stands, it's surrounded by some of the great Venetian masters. I mean, in a kind of strange way, it's opposite the Louvre's largest painting, Veronese's Wedding Feast at Cana. What is your take on its current surroundings?
Well, it basically kills the pictures around it. I mean, not in terms of the quality of painting, which the Veronese is a great, great painting, but in terms of audience behaviour, viewer behaviour, it kills the other pictures.
Moving it would not be simple. I mean, I mentioned the figure of 500 million euros. The French government or the French Cultural Ministry have come out and basically said, we will not pay for that. How do you get around that issue from your experience? Is there a solution in there?
I don't see a solution in there, but the way the French do those things is very individualistic, so I wouldn't dare to double guess how they solve that problem.
Regardless of whether or not they do, the speculation over the Mona Lisa is not going anywhere. I mean, as well as the story about the potential move, another story doing the rounds recently has been relating to the background behind the sitter. There's been speculation over the years about what this landscape represents. There's suggestions of Tuscany, Rimini, even the mountains of China. The latest is that a geologist, Anne Pizzarosso, is claiming that it's Lecco in northern Italy. And I understand that you don't agree with that. Could you just tell me about why?
Well, I'd say in general terms, and this is rather rude, that the silly season in Leonardo never ends. You somehow think you've got through it and it keeps coming back, and it makes it very difficult to look at Leonardo because you've got all this crowding in. There have been a lot of attempts to identify the Mona Lisa background with a real place. Pizzarosso's one is perfectly okay as they go, but it's not how Leonardo worked. He worked by looking at things, digesting them, deciding how they operated, and then remaking them. And, why is he going to choose a particular bit? That landscape has been identified as Urbino, somewhere near Arezzo. I think there are probably a dozen claimants to be the original Mona Lisa. There's a big question, why did he do it? Why did he choose this venue rather than another venue?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we have had someone write in. I mean, another Da Vinci expert, Jacques Franck, translated one of Pizzarosso's analysis because she's worked on other Da Vinci works, the version with St. Anne and also the version of the rocks. And the thing he has said that there is a lot of expertise behind her analysis. The National Centre for Scientific Research in France has said that it is incredibly thorough. And of course, beyond that, we know, and you obviously know very well, how important accuracy in depicting nature accurately was to Da Vinci. I mean, this expert that I just referenced points to, in the Royal Collection, there's a pair of rock studies that very clearly mimic those seen in the version in Child with St. Anne. So I just wondered, what makes you so convinced that this can't be Lecco?
Well, it's about Leonardo's ways of proceeding. I mean, it's rather like saying, that Virgin is based upon Giovanna Melzi or somebody or other. He doesn't work like that. He looks very, very hard at scenery. He looks very hard at rock formations. He looks very hard at mountains and understands how they're structured, how they work. And when he's working on the canal at Florence, the Arno Canal, he looks at the mountains around there and he decides that there are strata of shells. He calls them shells, so he doesn't have a word for fossils. They've been petrified by a particular virtue. And he looks at these and says, these are ancient things, much longer than the verbal record is. And that, in a sense, is what he's doing in this picture. In that picture in the background, it's not a precise definition of any known spot. The numbers of arches in the bridge are wrong for a start. And that was the same with the Arezzo one. Leonardo could count. What is happening there, and Anne Pizzarosso as a geologist should be very sympathetic to this. Leonardo is saying the old Arno Valley was two big seas or two big lakes at one point, and that they've broke through. And you see in the Mona Lisa the high lake and a low lake. Now, it doesn't mean to say this is a recreation of prehistoric situation in the Arno, but it's how he proceeds and thinks. He thinks the body of the woman is a living thing, is a changing thing, and the body of the landscape, the body of the earth, is a living and changing thing. And he dissects, as it were, the earth, rather like you dissect a body. And then he remakes the body of the earth and remakes the body of the person. So he's not doing 19th century topographical sketching.
No, although he did make maps famously, didn't he? So he was quite interested in specific detail. And it may be that he would draw on specific places and, the final result was an amalgamation.
Well, his theory about the two seas or lakes in the body of the earth, that's based upon very careful looking. And it's based upon maps. As we know it, in the early 1500s, he was contemplating a huge canal which would connect Florence to the sea, because it didn't have navigable route to the sea. And that great project involved him thinking about the early history of the Earth, where he could go. And he devised this great loop which went up via Prato and Pistoia. Now, that's where the motorway goes. He got his levels absolutely spot on. If we're looking at Mona Lisa and thinking about the background, the body of the earth and the body of the woman, we've got an absolutely key text by Leonardo about the microcosm. That's to say the lesser world, which is an old theory. It's become rather a commonplace. The idea of the human body is an analogue, is a simile for the world out there. Leonardo gives this old idea an entirely new kind of visual cogency. And this is what he wrote about it. By the ancients, man was termed a lesser world, and certainly the use of this name is well bestowed, because in that man is composed of water, earth, air and fire. His body is an analogue for the world, just as man has in himself bones, the supports and armature of the flesh. The world has the rocks, just as man has in himself the lake of blood in which the lungs increase and decrease during breathing, so the body of the earth has its oceanic seas, which likewise increase and decrease every 6 hours with the breathing of the world. Just as in that lake of blood the veins originate, which make ramifications throughout the human body, similarly the oceanic seas fills the body of the earth with infinite veins of water, venae d'aqua, veins of water. And this is happening in the picture. The relationship of this extraordinary ancient rock formation, which is going to change like the body of the woman. That text, I'd love to read it out beside the Mona Lisa for people to hear. It's incredibly resonant and gives a sense as to why you've got the body of the woman and the body of the earth. It's a great cosmic theme. This is not a portrait. As I said, it's a profound picture which goes off into these metaphysical directions.
So all of this debate and disagreement does raise a question, which is, when was the last time we had something concrete to say about the Mona Lisa? What was the last concrete discovery that you have agreed with, and your contemporaries and colleagues have also been in unison on that?
Well, I'd say the biggest visual results of the scientific analysis, the various pigment analyses and the infrareds and so on. So we've got a much greater sense of how that picture was made and built up. It hasn't solved all the problems because Leonardo's technique is incredibly difficult to read. He laid on layer after layer of glaze, of a large amount of linseed oil, not much pigment. He laid these very subtle glazes down, one on top of each other, so the pigments are all like veiled surfaces in a way.
The Mona Lisa, having said that, is in remarkable condition. It hasn't needed much restoration work, from my understanding, comparably to other Da Vinci works. Is that something that you think has helped its reputation?
It has been restored, but nobody now is going to touch it. And indeed, the last century, Pierre Rosenberg, one of the great directors of the Louvre, said, "No, I'm never going to touch this." And they cleaned the Madonna, Child and St. Anne in the Louvre, and they got enough stick for that. So they're certainly not going to stick their necks out with Mona Lisa. But the condition is problematic because it's very heavily cracked. This layering on of different levels of pigment, some probably before the lower levels have dried. There's an enormous amount of cracking in it. It's pretty thick surface and cracked like crazy paving. Somehow or other, we perceptually managed to look through this. We're used to seeing it's cracked, but somehow or other it's like listening to an old record of music, which is all crackly, but somehow or other we learn to filter that out.
I see. I mean, it was the highest insurance valuation of all time in the 1960s, at what was then $100 million, I think it was, which would be the equivalent of something like $1 billion now. I think that's one of the frustrations of the Mona Lisa, that it's priceless, so you can't really do much to protect it, including restoration, as you're saying.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the arrangements are in the French museums. In the museums in Britain, we've got a government indemnity. So all these things are insured by the government in theory. They just underwrite that. Whether the French have commercial insurance for the Louvre collections, I would really doubt that. I think it would be impossible to operate.
One of the things that is coming through and is well known about the Mona Lisa is its success doesn't feel completely tied to its quality as a work of art. I mean, obviously it is incredible, the atmosphere, the famous smile, details you don't notice for years, the fumato, but there are circumstantial parts of its history that have led to its fame. I'm thinking about the 1911 theft. I wondered if you have an opinion on how much history and circumstance has led to its fame now.
Well, the fame of the painting starts very early on. It's much copied, and portraits of bourgeois Florentine women were not copied. It became a picture. And I think Leonardo let the picture do that itself. I think it began as a portrait of La Gioconda, of Francesco Gioconda's wife, Lisa Gherardini. And the underlying layers, which we can now see, have a fairly orthodox costume. Gradually that becomes abstracted, and I think the Mona Lisa becomes a picture rather than being a portrait.
So you don't necessarily think it is a portrait of Gioconda?
That's how it began. It was a portrait of La Gioconda, and probably still is a decent likeness, but it becomes a picture into which Leonardo pours an enormous amount of knowledge, philosophy, optics, anatomy, notions of how the eye works and how we see. We talk about Leonardo's sfumato, which is not actually his word at all, but that technique of very ambiguous presentation of contours is very remarkable and sets up a very strange relationship with the spectator, because it gives you something indefinite.
And what are your views on things like, because the early 20th century was a big moment. I know it was in Napoleon's bedroom, for example, before that, so it had a big life in the centuries preceding, but how much of the 20th century scandal has led to where we are now? Yeah,
well, the stealing obviously had an effect, but it's often said that is when it became famous. The reason it was stolen was it was famous.
Yeah. Well, and also the Louvre employee or part-time employee who stole the work alleged that it had been taken by Napoleon and it belonged in Italy. And he falsely believed it had been taken by Napoleon. Yeah. And what's remarkable is Picasso was implicated. He was brought in for questioning, which is something that really is not talked about very much. It kind of adds to this mystique, I guess.
The Mona Lisa is surrounded by all these myths, legends, histories, etc., etc. Dan Brown, the Leonardo Code, would it have done as well as the Buonarroti Code? I suspect not.
And reeling back a bit, firstly, I've always wondered this. Do you know what Leonardo himself thought of the painting? Does he? I mean, he was very private, as you said to me earlier, but has he spoken much about, was he happy with it? He wasn't usually very happy. He gave up on a lot of projects.
Yeah, you've got almost no accounts of Leonardo of his own art. He tells you how to do this, how to do that, etc., but there's no comment on the works of art. There is with Michelangelo. You know, he writes complaining about his dilemma in the Sistine ceiling and all the pains and dreadful torments that this ceiling is inflicting upon him. Leonardo, none of that. Thousands and thousands of pages of notes, almost nothing personal. We simply don't know that.
And his contemporary, did his great rival Michelangelo have a view on the Mona Lisa that's on record?
Absolutely not.
Good to know, okay. And regardless of Da Vinci's own opinions, it has sparked frenzy in the years since. I mean, we've had artists from Raphael to Dali to Warhol-inspired making works after it, musicians Nat King Cole and Carlos Santana. It's been attacked endlessly. People have literally fallen in love with it. One person, I think, in the 1950s tried to cut it out of his frame and said he did so because he'd fallen in love with the picture. What do you think can explain that? Is it the artistic qualities you describe? Is it everything combined?
Well, the absolute baseline, the first thing is it is an incredibly remarkable picture. I've seen it or her twice out of the frame, and it's an unnerving experience. Some pictures have presence. Dmitry Rybolovlev, who had the Salvator Mundi, said it had vibration. That's rather nice. The picture does have a kind of life of its own. You see it out of the frame, you take it over into different light near the window, and the thing breathes. It has an enormous living quality. Now, this sounds like Sood's Corner in Private Eye, but it's the only way of describing it, as saying this is something which has a living presence. I wouldn't want to be in the same room with Mona Lisa at night. You know, there is that sense that the communication is just so strong. Cecilia Gallerani, the lady with the ermine, is nice, very charming. Mona Lisa is very inaccessible, a challenge, and this comes from Renaissance poetry. The beloved lady for Dante, for Petrarch, Boccaccio, was unattainable. They're ineffable, they were divine figures in a way. So there is that to begin with, which is a starting point. He then poured all this knowledge into it. We've talked about the geology and the notion of how the background is put together, but the whole optical setup, he became convinced that the eye was a very elusive organ. When a young man, he thought, I just do geometry of optics, and that's fine, I've understood it all. And he then realised, partly by Islamic science, which he knew, that the eye was a terrifically complicated optical device and was subject to all sorts of delusions. So the Mona Lisa, in a sense, is a monument to not quite being able to see something.
My question to that is, do people like complication these days? I think we live in such a transient culture. It's kind of fascinating that so many people flock to see a still picture that you can barely make out. Do you see the Mona Lisa's kind of pull remaining in the years to come? Should people be looking elsewhere is another question.
In a sense, the excitement of the Mona Lisa is over the top. It's excessive and no picture could sustain that. But it shows no sign of dying. I've done radio interviews to all manner of places, and I'm doing a tour of China, which they want to know about Leonardo, and I'm also going to Taiwan as well, so it is just extraordinary. At root, it must have that inherent quality, and the fast food sort of culture of just taking a selfie and going away, it adds to its fame, but it doesn't add to its understanding at all. And what I've tried to do is, I wrote a book on Mona Lisa with Giuseppe Palante, and I tried to strip it back to absolute basics and say, what do we know about this picture? What's the documentation? How does it tie in with Leonardo's own thinking, his own notes? What can we get out of his discussions of painting, which are very extensive and incredibly complicated? How did he put that into the Mona Lisa, and how does it captivate our imagination?
Martin, obviously in a lot of ways you're in a privileged position because you've had the joy of decades of being very up close to this work in many different ways. Yet the large majority of us are not. Do you think that there is a shame in the fact that the general public will not have the joy of that intimacy, of being close to the Mona Lisa? And it may never happen even if it gets its own room.
Yeah, it is an intransigent thing that you've got all these people wanting to see it, and that kills the intimacy which is integral to the picture. And this is not a soluble thing.
Thank you so much, Martin.
My pleasure.
You can read our Leonardo stories on the website or the app. Coming up, Judy Chicago on her first London survey and Christian Schad in Vienna. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. The British Museum has successfully recovered a further 268 stolen objects following the theft of Greek and Roman antiquities by a curator. Most of the works taken were gems, although there were also pieces of jewellery and other items. Around 2,000 pieces were either stolen or severely damaged. Itai Gradel, a Danish collector and dealer who acquired 351 pieces without realising they were stolen and was the whistleblower on the theft, has already returned those he had bought. With the recovery of the 268 further items, it means that the museum has secured the return of more than 600 pieces. The British Museum trustees decided last December to pursue civil litigation against Peter Higgs, the former acting head of the Greece and Rome department, who was dismissed in the wake of the news of the thefts. Legal action was initiated in March in the High Court to give the museum access to Higgs' eBay and PayPal accounts in order to help identify purchasers of the stolen items. A museum spokesperson says that it's working on new leads for a further 100 items, with investigations presumably assisted by the eBay and PayPal records. Lawyers representing the US artist Kehinde Wiley say that he will take any and all necessary actions to clear his name, including starting legal action against the British-born Ghanaian artist Joseph Awadako, who claims Wiley sexually assaulted him in June 2021. In an Instagram post from the 19th of May, Awadako alleged 2 sexual assaults, the first during a dinner held at the Noldor Artist Residency in Ghana, which Awadako founded in 2020, and the second later that evening. Wiley said in a statement that the relationship was brief and consensual, and that the accusations are false, disturbing and defamatory. The British artist Damien Hirst is under scrutiny for backdating his works. A report published in The Guardian newspaper on Wednesday revealed that at least 1,000 of the oil paintings on paper created for a project called The Currency were not made in 2016, as the artist stated. It reported that they were in fact mass-produced in 2018 and 2019 by dozens of painters hired by Hirst's company, Science Limited, at 2 studios in Gloucestershire and London. In total, 10,000 paintings were made for the project, which was launched in 2021 by Hirst and Henny, the publishing platform run by the artist's business manager, which was authorised to sell the works. They said at the time that the paintings were, quote, created by hand in 2016. Dates attributed to works of art are conventionally understood to refer to the year in which they were completed, but lawyers for Science and Henny say it is usual practice for Hirst to date works according to when they were conceived. Hirst's lawyers used the same response to earlier accusations in The Guardian that several formaldehyde sculptures were dated by his company to the 1990s, despite being made in 2017. You can read all these stories and much more on the website or the app. Now, at the Serpentine North in London, Judy Chicago has just unveiled a major new show, Revelations. The title is taken from an illuminated manuscript made in the 1970s and previously unshown, but now updated and published for the first time in a book accompanying the Serpentine show. While the exhibition reflects the breadth of the now 84-year-old artist's work, including documentation of and studies for her most famous projects like The Dinner Party, made between 1974 and 1979, and The Birth Project, made between 1980 and 1985, its primary focus is on the drawings she's made from her emergence in the art world of the 1960s to new work for Revelations. I went to the Serpentine to talk to her. Judy, running through Revelations are your drawings. There is a wonderful array of drawings. Why did you want to emphasise those in this exhibition?
I mean, it wasn't my decision from the beginning. Hans Ulrich wanted to do a retrospective of my career through my drawings, which was a good thing because, you know, this Serpentine is a small gallery, and I'm just coming off of this massive retrospective at the new museum. They have 17,000 square feet, and Serpentine had 3,000 feet. So he had this idea of doing a whole new kind of retrospective, what he calls a retrospective for the 21st century that would be low carbon, which meant not a lot of crates, that would be immersive, multimedia, that would go between analog and digital, which my work crosses, would also provide avenues of participation and collaboration. And as you know, Hans Ulrich is a very visionary curator. One of the things he and I have been talking about is that we actually have achieved those goals in this show, which I'm exceedingly glad about. I think it brings a whole new perspective to my work. And you have to realize that at one point in my career, when nobody could stand what I drew, it was very popular to say I couldn't draw.
But it's so abundantly clear you can. And so variously too. It seems to me that you're not set in your style of drawing at all. There are wonderfully vivid expressionist works from the Illuminations series, for instance, but then you have this gorgeous kind of clear, crisp line when it comes to things like the Birth Project and so on. So tell me about the role that drawing has in your life. Is it a kind of a daily discipline? Will you start the day with a drawing,
Well,
for
it
instance?
used to be a daily discipline when I wasn't all engrossed in having all these major exhibitions. I got interviewed before the new museum show, and the woman said to me, "What are you doing to prepare for this exhibition?" And I knew she had this image of me in my studio madly painting. And I said, "Is that before or after I wake up to 13 emails from Massimiliano Gioni, the curator?" And then double that, working with Massimiliano and Hans Ulrich simultaneously, two of the best curators in the world.
But most demanding curators.
Yes, most demanding curators, right, you know. And then there was the time change. So, you know, waking up because Britain went to sleep and we woke up and there were all these emails from Chris Bailey and will you look at this and will you look at that? So, I mean, I brought my drawing book with me because I always try and do that. But when I was younger, I drew constantly. First of all, drawing was like breathing to me. As I've said often, much to my parents' chagrin, I started drawing before I started talking, because in my family, which was an intellectual family, talking was really important. But it used to be like when I would travel, I would draw on the plane. Like I did a whole series of Birth Project drawings, the landscape drawings actually, on the plane. But I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of drawing in the show, the Revelation show, that, like the book, I never thought would be seen. because, like the birth project drawings, you have to realize when I started down the road of exploring the subject of birth, at that point, Frida Kahlo's birth famous painting was not even known. She was just considered Diego Rivera's wife, who also painted. And I thought there were no images of birth in contemporary art until I saw, which is how I met Massimiliano. He did a show in Milan called The Great Mother. The show was unbelievable, but it included work by both male and female artists dating back to the earliest 20th century movements, Dada, Futurism, where there was a lot of imagery about birth and motherhood, which taught me that not only were women artists erased, but any subject matter that was not considered important, because it's what women did, was also erased. But anyway, so some of those drawings were done in the birthing chamber when I was witnessing my first birth. But there was so much taboo around that subject that there was no way those kind of direct drawings could be shown.
It's extraordinary today to think that. But you really were fighting systems everywhere, weren't you?
That's an understatement. Everybody who knows anything about my career knows that. It's, because I get asked all the time, how did you not give up? Well, in my family, it was get up or give up.
I wanted to ask about the intimacy of those drawings now being shown, because, of course, as you say, some of them are not prepared for exhibition. They're about you noting things down, about you thinking through your ideas and so on. Does it make this, therefore, a very personal show if you've got drawings front, left, centre, everywhere?
I was actually quite terrified about both the show and the book, because as much as I wanted my vision, the underlying vision of my work understood, I had no idea what kind of response there was going to be. I mean, I have devoted my entire life to working for justice and equity, and for all creatures on the planet, not just human. I mean, I've been called naive, I've been called overly idealistic. I mean, my position on that is without hope. We're just lost as a human race. But I had just no idea what kind of response there was going to be. So it's been very overwhelming, actually, very overwhelming. Also, the shift. I mean, there is such a huge generational change in the response to my work. I'd kind of gotten used to this brick wall of resistance, and it was kind of like, yet another bad review. Oh, yeah, old news. What else is new, right? So it's very new and overwhelming to me.
But one of the things that you said in the past, and I think it's really telling through the show, is that, if you like, the lack of attention, especially from the market, permitted you the space to develop your language perhaps more fully than an artist who's permanently producing for the market might be able to. And that seems to me to be borne out through the show, this rich language that you developed. And I mean language in terms of the drawing language, but also your cursive script, which is just like this rhythm through the show time and again. It seems to me that that's an important sort of texture in the show, if you like.
That's an interesting insight. I think I agree with that. I don't think anybody's ever actually talked about that, the relationship between the line of my cursive writing and the line of my drawing. I'm thinking about that because you're absolutely right about the relationship between them. I mean, now a lot of times I draw and I write simultaneously. But when I was young, and like Anais Nin, who was my mentor, encouraged me to write, she said I could write. And at that time, the idea of an artist writing was just complete taboo. Like you're supposed to be mute. And of course, that completely obfuscated the fact of this whole art system that was aimed at writing about the art of all these guys who got to be mute, right?
Yeah. You're invading their territory somehow, so don't write, because that's our job.
Right. But also the thing about the market, I don't think people understand how really stupid I was when I was young. I had no idea about the market. And in fact, there wasn't very much market when I started out in LA in the 60s. None of my male peers thought they were going to make money from art. It was completely out of anybody's mind. It was like the goal was to be taken seriously by other artists in the art world. That was it. And in fact, when I was working on the dinner party, even I think this is preposterous. When I was working on the dinner party, I because it took so long to get the plates right, and so I did a lot of test plates because they kept breaking. So we had visitors, and this one woman who was a collector in LA came, and she said, I remember she saw this Hatshepsut test plate, kind of like the one that's in the show, but that belongs to Diane Gellin. Anyway, she says to me, I'd like to buy this. How much is it? And I said, you dare to ask me to equate my art with money?
What a preposterous idea.
I am telling you, I was really stupid.
I think you've also said that when you embarked on the Holocaust project with Donald, who's here with us, that neither of you said to each other, like, the market's really not going to go for this, is it? You know, that you're wanting to commit to ideas
right,
that don't have a market value, right?
Never crossed our minds,
right.
Actually. I mean, I don't think that the market has been exactly good for art.
I'd agree with that. Let's talk about the prescience of the show, because I think that's really crucial as a sort of theme through the show. When you look at the drawings for the end, when you look at your drawings of toxic masculinity, a figure behind a steering wheel polluting the planet, you know, you really feel that you were tapping into the urgency of the climate emergency way back in the 80s and before. When you take these works out and re-show them and so on, it must give you a jolt to a certain degree.
Well, actually, what gave me a jolt was, you know, that Hans Ulrich was the one who was like determined to find some unrealized project of mine.
He's always on about unrealized projects.
Relentless. He's relentless. And so our studio manager, Megan Schultz, took out this manuscript that had been sitting basically in the drawer for 50 years. And Hans Ulrich took one look at it, read some of it, and said, Judy, this manuscript is foundational to your entire career. You know, I want it to be the catalog of the book, and then I burst into tears. But the thing is that over the summer, because the turnaround time for the production of the book was really fast, 5 months, I had to go kind of into seclusion to edit it, update it, and do the new drawings. And when I was editing it, I was reading it, I realized he was absolutely right. You know, because the early chapters are based on my research in women's history and discovering that all early societies worship goddesses, and it prefigures the Birth Project. And then it definitely prefigures power play. And, of course, I did power play. I started doing it in 1982 while I was still working on the Birth Project. And as is my wont, I went to the library and looked up gender. And the only books that came up were books about women, as if only women had gender. You know, it's before gender theory, queer theory, masculinity studies. And what did blow me away was realizing that Revelations predicts the climate crisis 50 years before it happened. And I realized that probably my understanding of that grew out of my understanding and study of the history of patriarchy, and that the paradigm of dominating and vanquishing and exploiting the planet that we've been taught was basic to the development of Western civilization, and now we see it around other civilizations too, was going to eventually lead to that. So what I think I never dreamed, actually, was that other people were going to read Revelations and see what I saw.
Right. And to use two words which are used constantly today, the Revelations Project is intersectional and it's holistic. It's entirely binding these things. It sees the connection between patriarchy and the climate emergency, as you say. It sees the connection between the suppression of women and the climate emergency and so on. And it seems to me that that's absolutely vital through your work, actually. Always you're connecting themes. You can see it all the way through these galleries, and the way that the gallery is laid out actually allows you to make these sort of comparisons between bodies of work and so on. But you're always connecting ideas.
Yeah, I think Chris Bailey, the curator, did a really good job in terms of the show and also the sight lines of the show, the way you can look down a gallery and you can see a work that connects with, either through color, form, or concept with another work. Oh, the thing that's really funny about that I enjoyed a lot was bringing the idea of color into the gallery. You can't imagine how they reacted when I suggested painting the walls. You know, because most of Serpentine shows have been black and white, as you know. But then when they painted the walls, Chris Bailey wrote and he said, "Oh my God, it transformed the gallery." And I'm like, right.
It's a very Judy Chicago way of doing things, and it's absolutely unique. So congratulations on the show. Judy, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Judy Chicago, Revelations is at the Serpentine North in London until the 1st of September. And finally, it's time for the work of the week. The Leopold Museum in Vienna this week opens an exhibition dedicated to the Neue Sachlichkeit, or New Objectivity movement in Germany, a response to the urgent social and political questions that emerged from the horrors of the First World War, which attempted to find a new language following the demise of German Expressionism after the war. Among the most distinctive artists of the period was Christian Schad, who was born in Bavaria in 1894, became a Dadaist in Geneva, and then spent time in Naples, Vienna and Berlin, among other places. The curator of the exhibition is the Leopold Museum's director, Hans-Peter Wipplinger, and I spoke to him about Schad's painting Self-Portrait with Model from 1927. Hans-Peter, to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about Christian Schad?
Christian Schad is indeed one of the most important artists of the new objectivity movement in Germany. And we have the pleasure that we included 9 different paintings by this artist, especially also this iconic piece, the self-portrait with the model, which is wonderful, coming from the Tate in London, but was painted by Christian Schad in Vienna.
Right.
So the painting comes back to our city. Schad lived here between 1925 and 27, and also some portraits of other models and friends he did in our country.
Now tell us about the Neue Sachlichkeit, because one of the things about that movement is Sachlichkeit is a difficult word to translate. So as you say, it's called New Objectivity, but there's been some debate about what that word actually means. People have called it also the new matter-of-factness. But in any sense, it's a reaction to Expressionism to a certain extent, isn't it?
Yeah, as a new objectivity, we call it, is a movement which was dominating Europe and also in America in the 1920s. And we use the jubilee of the first exhibition, which was in 1925 at the Kunsthalle in Mannheim. And Hartlaub, the name of the director, made this legendary show, which was divided in 2 different movements. On the one hand, we have the left wing. On the other side, the right wing of this movement. The left wing was, for instance, artists like Otto Dix, Georges Grosz, in the early beginning, also Christian Schad. on the right wing, more, let's say, classical positions, artists who orientated their style on Renaissance, on the Nazarener artists as well, neo-romantic positions. The left wing was very political orientated and interested in, and a lot of critique on the political system after the First World War. They described in their paintings, drawings, and so on. And we start in this show, which exists out of, I think, 150 works, exhibits from numerous international and private collections we gathered here in this show. So it was a very diverse, I would say, pluralistic style with aspects of post-expressionism as well, Cubo-futuristic aspects. On the one hand, the Dadaism was also from 1980 to 21 an important influence, but more and more this, let's say, coolness, this focus on strong linearity and to a glassy atmosphere in the painting, the very strict static manner they make their composition, and the clean surface was more and more coming out. And Hartlaub, this director, made the show, presented this the first time, and it's the first show we did about this movement in Austria. We did some other shows the last years about Austrian new objectivity, but now we go back to the, let's say, homeland of this stylistic aesthetic movement.
Right. And your show is called Splendour and Misery. And it seems to me that you couldn't have a better image to talk about splendour and misery than this Christian Schad painting, this self-portrait with a model, because there is a sort of an aspect of glamour about it, undoubtedly. There's a kind of incredible louche kind of quality to it, but also there is a sense of alienation, of angst in it. And holding those two kind of moods together seems to me to be the absolute central point of this painting.
Yes, it's indeed a dichotomy between these both figures Christian Schad is showing us. On the one hand, this strong self-portrait, this document of coolness, but also very sensitive in the style. Typically is also that there is no communication, no relationship between these both figures. Obviously, he painted it in a memory of a sexual intercourse between this lady and himself. But what is typical is the kind of Narcissus. There's also this flower, the Narcissus in Germany.
Yeah, the Narcissus, yeah.
Yeah, which is a metaphor for this self-reflection. As I mentioned, it was done in Vienna. It's such an icon because all the details, the focus of the details, the body, the eyes, the folds in the face is very precise, very purism style and objectivity style. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, there's a sort of unbelievable precision about it. But also the story of the woman who is behind Christian Schad is really intriguing, isn't it? Because is it right that she's effectively built from memories of people he encountered, that this isn't a real person as such, in terms of a person that was part of his intimate life, as it were?
We have no information about this, but we know that he lived in Naples in South Italy for a while, and this lady had a very impressive scar in her face, in her beautiful face, which is a sign of a South Italian jealous man who marked unfazed women with this scar. And so there is probably a relationship to South Italy, and probably he knows this lady, but we are not sure.
Right. And the Narcissus flower that is behind her, you can just see the corner of a glass, can't you, from which it's emerging, or a vase. But basically, the Narcissus flower points more at him than her, right? It seems to be angled towards him. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that Schad is looking at himself and commentating perhaps on his own vanity.
Yes. I mean, the self-introspection is normally a style of expressionism.
Right.
We see the portraits of new objectivity artists. We see a lot of surface and not the insights into a character. It's not a mirror of the soul in general. This is an exception, I would say. He was very interested, and of course, maybe it was a self-critique to present himself in front of us as spectators. So it's strange how he described himself in this manner.
Yeah, it is. And of course, he's veiled. He has this see-through kind of chemise or shirt or even perhaps a robe on, whereas she is naked, but you can just get a glimpse of a stocking. But you see his body, but it's veiled. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that that's a comment on observing himself and observing his own character and perhaps veiling the true identity of himself. So there's all sorts of symbolism. He was big on symbolism, basically, wasn't he?
Absolutely. And maybe it's much more exciting to see this transparent shirt than he was also totally naked. So it had also to do with lust, I would say, and it's a strong impression of sexuality and also loneliness. And maybe he wanted to show us which great master in painting he is, because to paint such a transparent shirt, it's, I think, not easy. But he was perfect also in the other paintings we are presenting in the show. They called him often in the art scene the master of painting the skin, the incarnate, yeah.
And he'd studied masters when he was in Italy. He was in Naples from 1920 to 1925, right? So he'd looked a lot at historical painting whilst he was there, having emerged from Dada. So he was making photograms, right, in Dada,
yes,
and then almost did a complete volte-face and headed for Italy and old masters, and he transported that kind of classical language into a very modern style, a very modern idiom, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Like a lot of other artists of the new Objectivity group, they orientated strongly on the old masters of Italy or of Spain or also of German old masters.
Right. But there's no doubt that this is a modern painting, which is a curious thing. He's not attempting to emulate those old masters. Yes. He's presenting their language, if you like, in a completely modern circumstance.
Yeah. If you look at the women on the painting, the hairstyle, it was also a very fashionable cut at that time. So the movement and the emancipation of the women was also a strong theme in the 1920s. So we had a singular room in the show presenting this strong women, not only by Christian Schad, but also by Alexander Canold, for instance, or the artist Lotte Laserstein, a lady presenting herself as a tennis player, for instance.
Right. And that's the curious thing about the presentation of the woman in this painting, is it's very ambiguous in the sense that, yes, as you mentioned, she has this horrific scar on her face, which was, as you say, a symbol of kind of masculine possession of women. But she is very strident and defiant in her pose, in the way she looks away from Christian Schad, and her profile is incredibly strong, isn't it? So do you think Christian Schad is attempting to comment on her strength? Is it a direct comment of that?
I mean, it seems clear that the new Objectivity was a direct answer of the phenomenon of this time, this period, and how he painted was quite unsentimental and puristic manner. It was a comment, the whole ups and downs in the Weimar Republic, of course, and he was in a way outstanding. He was not on the left or the right wing like Max Beckmann.
Right.
The painting of Max Beckmann is somewhere between, but is not part of one of these both wings.
And then in terms of reception, you mentioned that he was renowned as a painter of skin, but was this work critically well received? Do we have any idea of its reception?
He was part of this very legendary show, and he was also a star in the 20s as a painter, and a lot of women was very keen on be portrayed by him. Also men, we have, I think, 2 men's portraits as well in the show. So I think he's one of the artists in our presentation who is very famous. I think we have 41 different artists, 9 artists, a woman artist, and the rest are men. And beside Dix and Gross and Carnold, he's part of the most famous one. There are a lot of unknown artists as well in our presentation. As I mentioned, the first time present in this comprehensive way the new Objectivity of Germany in our museum. It's a tour through nearly 50 years of art production of Germany, and this one is quite different positions. And it ends, as we know, with Hitler's take over the power in 1933. And most of the artists we are presenting are then the so-called degenerate artists, and was presented in this show 1937 in Munich and other parts of Germany and cities of Germany. And some of them have to leave the country, migrate, like Beckmann or like Felix Nussbaum. He was murdered in the concentration camp in Auschwitz. So some organized themselves with the system. A heavy time, and I think also a very actual exhibition, because we have a lot of tendencies and, let's say, analogies between the 1920s and the 2020s, thinking, for instance, about anti-Semitism all over the world now, or also there are a lot of femicide, lust-murdered women, which is also a theme. The angst against globalization, digitalization, artificial intelligence. You can also compare this with industrialization of the 1920s, where there's another room just dealing with this theme. The people thought functionalism and realism comes over the human being, and the relationship between the human being and the machine, the robot, makes them nervous. So we have 13 different themes in this presentation, and I think a lot of the themes are actual nowadays as well.
Well, Hans-Peter, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your interest.
Splendour and Misery, New Objectivity in Germany is at the Leopold Museum in Vienna until the 29th of September. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Tan Audio, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Michalska, Alexander Morrison, and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Martin, Judy, and Hans-Peter. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.